Ryan Mitchell grabbed the older man's collar with both hands and shoved him hard against the chain-link fence. "You don't belong here," Ryan said, his face 2 inches away, jaw tight, eyes cold. "Go home to your kid." The entire training field went silent. 21 candidates stopped moving. 3 instructors turned around. And Ethan Carter, the quiet man with the worn boots and the shaking hand, did not flinch, did not blink, did not reach up to remove Ryan's hands from his collar. He just looked at him, the way a man looks at something that no longer has the power to scare him. "Let go," Ethan said, quietly, almost gently. Ryan didn't. So Ethan moved. What happened in the next 4 seconds, nobody in that field could fully explain afterward. One moment, Ryan Mitchell, 210 pounds of Division I athlete and 2 years of ranger training, had a man pinned against a fence. The next moment, Ryan was on the ground face down, one arm locked behind his back at an angle that made 2 nearby candidates visibly wince, and Ethan Carter was kneeling over him with his knee between Ryan's shoulder blades, not even breathing hard. "I said let go," Ethan repeated in exactly the same quiet tone. From across the field, a voice cut through the silence. "Carter!" Ethan looked up. Colonel James Whitaker was standing 40 feet away, perfectly still. He wasn't looking at Ryan Mitchell on the ground. He wasn't looking at the stunned candidates around the fence. He was looking at Ethan's forearm, where the sleeve had torn, in the struggle, where a tattoo was now fully visible for the first time. A black snake, 7 coils, 3 numbers beneath it, 731. The colonel's face went completely white. He took 1 step forward, then stopped. Then slowly, in front of every candidate, every instructor, every person on that field, he reached up and removed his helmet. And he saluted. "My God," Colonel Whitaker said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the field was so silent that every single person heard it. "We were told you were dead. Drop a comment right now. With the city you're watching from, I want to track how far this story reaches. And if that 4 seconds just stopped your heart a little, hit subscribe, because what comes before this moment and what comes after is going to hit even harder." The morning Ethan Carter drove to Fort Liberty, he stopped once. Not for gas, not for coffee. He pulled over on a 2-lane road outside the base perimeter, put the truck in park, and sat there with the engine running and both hands flat on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, the sky was still mostly dark, that particular gray-blue of 4:45 in the morning, that doesn't belong to night or day, that exists only in the space between the two, when the world hasn't committed to anything yet. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He'd already read it 100 times. He read it again. "Good luck, Daddy." Purple crayon, slightly uneven letters, the handwriting of a child, trying very hard to be neat. In the corner, a drawing, a stick-figure man in a uniform standing next to a little girl with curly hair and a gap-toothed smile. Underneath, in careful block letters that must have taken Lily a long time, "Come home." 2 words. That was the whole card. Ethan folded it back along the same creases. He always folded it along the same creases. The paper was already soft at those lines, and put it back over his chest. Then he put the truck in drive. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. The staging area at Fort Liberty's tactical training compound smelled like dew on concrete and anxious men. Ethan arrived at 4:58 and took his place in formation without being told where to go. He'd memorized the layout from a document he wasn't supposed to have access to, which meant he'd read it 3 times, committed the spatial details to memory, and then destroyed it. He stood in position, 7 left flank, 3rd row, and he looked at nothing in particular, and he listened to everything. 22 candidates in this cohort. He'd built files on all of them over the past 3 weeks, working from what he could access legitimately and filling the gaps from other sources. Mostly men in their mid to late 20s. The right builds, the right backgrounds. Former Rangers Infantry, 1 Marine Recon, 2 ex-SEAL candidates. By every standard metric, exactly the kind of men you wanted. Ethan was not that kind of man. Not visibly. Not today. His uniform was regulation, but looked like it had been through the wash 60 more times than anyone else's. His boots were clean but not new. His posture was slightly wrong, not parade ground wrong, just tired wrong. The posture of a man carrying something he'd been carrying too long. And his face, when the younger candidates looked at it, said 36 years in a way that felt in this environment like an accusation. The man who stepped into formation to his left was big, not just tall, constructed, the kind of build that announced itself before the person did. He looked at Ethan the way you look at a car taking up 2 parking spaces. Not quite anger, just the low-grade offense of someone who believes the situation should have been arranged better. "You're in the wrong spot," the man said. "Position 7, left flank, 3rd row," Ethan said. He wasn't looking at him. He was watching the building across the compound where the instructors would emerge. "Formation check sheet puts me here. I'm talking about in general." Ethan let that sit for a moment. "I know," he said. He felt the man stare at the side of his face. Then the man looked forward again. "Good." The instructors came out at 5:02. 3 of them led by Master Sergeant Dolan, a man built like a fire hydrant who had clearly spent several decades weaponizing his voice. He walked the formation slowly, not to inspect it, to compress it, to see what happened when pressure was applied uniformly, which men expanded under it, and which men contracted. He stopped in front of Ethan. The silence stretched. "How old are you, candidate?" 36, Ethan said. Something moved behind Dolan's eyes, not the something Ethan expected, which was dismissal. Something more ambiguous than that. Then Dolan moved on. From the far right of the formation, a voice practiced designed to carry said, 36, my dad's 36. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. The sound of a group locating its dynamic, identifying its outlier, confirming the story it had already decided to tell about the formation it was part of. Ethan filed the voice. He already knew the name attached to it. Ryan Mitchell, 28, former wide receiver at a Division I program. Then Ranger School consistently high performance assessments, consistently noted in evaluations with phrases like natural leader and high social influence, which were in Ethan's experience military euphemisms for the kind of man who could move a group in any direction he chose, including the wrong one. He was going to be useful. He just didn't know it yet. The first drill was a 6-mile weighted run, 45-pound pack. The pace was calibrated to be deceptive, not punishing in an obvious immediate way, but in a cumulative way, so that the back half of the run separated the disciplined from the merely athletic. Ethan ran it near the back, not last. There were 2 candidates genuinely laboring behind him, but he ran it wrong enough, breathing a little too audibly, favoring his right side in a pattern that read as a poorly managed old injury. Left hand developing a tremor around mile 4 that was visible if you were watching for it. He was watching to see who watched for it. Ryan Mitchell watched for it. He dropped back from the front cluster at mile 4 and came alongside Ethan without invitation, the way dominant men in competitive environments approach weaker-looking men, not quite menace, but also not purely concern. "You okay?" Ryan asked. "Fine," Ethan said. "Your hand's shaking." "Old injury." "You told intake about that." "I told them what I needed to tell them." Ethan kept his eyes forward, his breathing audibly effortful. Ryan ran beside him for another stretch, and Ethan could feel him making calculations. Threat assessment of a different kind. Not is this man dangerous, but what is this man's presence going to cost me? "That bracelet," Ryan said. "Kid made that for you." Ethan didn't look down at it. Purple and green braided thread, Lily's school colors made at a craft table in an after-school program, and presented to him that evening with the solemnity of a head of state bestowing a decoration. He wore it on his right wrist every day. "Yeah," Ethan said. "How old?" 8. Ryan nodded, slowly processing. "Then what are you doing here, man? You've got a kid at home. You're 36. No offense, but you're clearly not—" He stopped himself. then continued, which was somehow worse than if he'd stopped. "This isn't the right fit for you." Ethan ran 4 strides before he answered. "I'll think about that," he said. Ryan surged back toward the front. Ethan watched him go and filed the interaction carefully. Ryan Mitchell was not cruel exactly. He was something more complicated than that, a man who had been the standard for so long that he had confused himself with the standard. He didn't dislike Ethan. He genuinely could not conceive of a version of events in which Ethan belonged here, and the gap between that conviction and the fact of Ethan's presence was creating for Ryan a kind of low-grade cognitive irritation. That irritation was going to grow, and when it grew large enough, Ryan was going to act on it in front of an audience. Ethan had planned for this. He crossed the 6-mile mark, 4 minutes behind the leading cluster, breathing hard, left hand tremoring slightly at his side. He looked exactly like a man who had just barely made it. Lunch was 40 minutes. Mess hall, heat lamp eggs, the social architecture of 22 competitive men arranging themselves instinctively by perceived status. Ethan took a tray and sat at the end of a table near the back wall alone, and he ate slowly, and he listened with the practiced attention of a man who had spent years in environments where listening well was the difference between coming home and not. Ryan held court at the center table. Ethan could hear his voice without straining. "The old guy. I'm telling you, Dolan's going to cut him by Wednesday. There's no way he passes the physical battery. Did you see his hand on the back half of the run?" Laughter. The comfortable laughter of a group that had identified its consensus. Ethan registered this and moved his attention to the table almost directly behind him, where 2 candidates were sitting close together over food. They weren't really eating. Derek Foss. Thomas Gallagher. He'd flagged both of them from the files. Not for anything obvious. Nothing in their records that read as a red flag, if you were looking for the usual red flags. But in the files of 22 candidates, these 2 had a particular quality. They had been placed in this cohort through a chain of administrative decisions that, when you traced it carefully, had involved the same 3 signatures at each decision point. 3 signatures that also appeared in a document Ethan had memorized before he left home. He didn't look at them directly. He didn't need to. He adjusted the angle of his shoulder by ½ an inch and caught fragments. Timeline moved up. Confirmed. Not next month. It's... Someone dropped something, and the ambient noise of the mess hall swallowed the rest. Ethan ate his eggs. He looked like a man thinking about nothing more pressing than whether the eggs were worth finishing. He was thinking about the 3 signatures. He was thinking about the timeline. He was thinking about the 4 names of the men he'd served with who had not come home, and the 5 years since then in which the person responsible had remained inside the system, protected, invisible, still making decisions. He was thinking about Lily's card folded over his chest. Come home. He was going to come home. But first, he was going to finish what he'd come here to do. The afternoon drill was obstacle stations. 3 in sequence, timed, scored, watched by the instructors with the efficient humorlessness of men who had seen every performance and been impressed by very few. First station, wall scale. 12 feet of smooth plywood, 1 rope, 30 seconds. Ryan went first. He hit the wall like it had done something to him personally, and he cleared the top in 8 seconds with a physicality that was genuinely impressive. He landed on the other side and turned around, and his expression said exactly what his expression always said. I know what I just did. Did you see what I just did? The group saw it. They made the appropriate sounds. Then Ethan stepped up. He looked at the wall for a half beat too long, which read as uncertainty. He grabbed the rope. He went up slowly, methodically, technically correct in a way he was actively suppressing each movement, 3 beats slower than it could have been. He hesitated at the top. He got a leg over. He came down the other side. 22 seconds. Not last, but close. Take your time, someone called from the line. Generous, mocking laughter. Dolan looked at his clipboard, then at Ethan, then at the clipboard again. Carter, he said, run it again. Ethan looked at him, Dolan's face was unreadable. I want to see it again. It was unusual. Ethan went back around. This time he let himself be slightly worse. 26 seconds. More visible effort. The faintest hesitation at the top that read as a man fighting through something. When he landed, Dolan said nothing. He made a mark on his clipboard. But Ethan felt the sergeant's eyes return to him twice more over the next 40 minutes. Not the eyes of a man watching a weak candidate fail. Something else. Something that Ethan could not quite categorize, which meant it required attention. He filed it. At 8:30 that evening in the rec room, Ryan Mitchell came and sat across from Ethan. He had the particular energy of a man who had been building toward something all day and had finally decided to say it. "I'm going to be straight with you," Ryan said. "All right," Ethan said, not looking up from the book he wasn't reading. "You're not going to make it through this program." Ethan looked at him over the top of the page. "I'm not saying it to be a jerk," Ryan said, and the strange thing was that he meant it or believed he did. "I'm saying it because someone should. You're 36. Your hand shakes. I watched you on that wall today." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "What are you trying to prove?" Ethan set the book down. He looked at Ryan Mitchell for a long moment. The kind of look that could be mistaken for someone getting emotional when it was actually someone reading a text very carefully. "My daughter made me a card," Ethan said. "It says 2 things on it. Her name and come home." He picked the book back up. "That's what I'm trying to prove." Ryan sat there. "That's not what this program is for," he said finally. "I know exactly what this program is for," Ethan said. Quietly, without emphasis. Something crossed Ryan's face, the beginning of a thought that didn't quite complete. He stood up and went back to his table and his people, and Ethan watched him go and thought, he'll push again. He just needs an audience big enough to make it feel worth it. Across the room, Foss and Gallagher sat close together. Gallagher glanced at Ethan once, a fast, almost involuntary movement, the way you glance at something peripheral when your instinct fires before your thinking catches up. Ethan didn't look up, but he saw it. He saw everything. He called Lily at 9 from the hallway. She picked up on the second ring. "Daddy?" Not a question. "Hey, baby girl. You eat?" "Mrs. Hendricks made pasta. Wrong noodles." I was polite. "That's my girl." A pause, the sound of sheets, already in bed. "How was it?" "Fine," he said. "It was fine. Did you make any friends?" He closed his eyes. The hallway was cold, and the fluorescent light above him buzzed slightly, an irregular rhythm, almost like a signal. "Working on it." "Daddy!" The register dropped the one she used when she was about to say something she'd been deciding whether to say. He had been listening to that register for 6 years, and it still made him stand up straighter. "I had a dream about you." "What happened?" "You were in a field," she said. "A big open field, and there were a lot of people around you, but none of them could see you. Like you were invisible." She paused. "And then something happened. I don't know what, and they all saw you at once. Everybody saw you at the same time." Ethan stood very still. "Was it a good dream or a bad dream?" he asked. "Both," she said, with the certainty of a child who has not yet learned to make feelings smaller than they are. "You looked sad, but also like something was finally over." Another pause. "Is that weird?" "No," he said. "That's not weird." "Are you okay, Daddy?" "I'm okay." He meant it, or he meant the version of it that was true. "I promise." "Okay." She believed him. The weight of that of being someone an 8-year-old believed without reservation sat on him the way it always sat on him, not crushing, but constant. Something he carried every waking moment and never put down. "I love you more than you know," he said. "I love you more than that," she said. He stood in the hallway for a moment after she hung up, phone still warm in his hand, the light above him buzzing its irregular rhythm. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked back into the rec room. He sat in his corner. He picked up the book. Across the room, Foss and Gallagher had moved their chairs another 6 inches closer together. They weren't looking at anyone. They were looking at their hands. And in the careful, practiced stillness of a man who had spent years learning to be the last thing anyone looked at in a room, Ethan Carter sat and watched and waited. Beneath his sleeve, coiled around 7 silent loops, a black snake waited with him. 731. The number of a unit that was never supposed to exist. The number of men who were never supposed to come back. The number that one man, one betrayer still inside the system, still breathing, still making decisions, had tried to erase from the earth. Ethan turned a page of the book he wasn't reading. Tomorrow, he thought. Let them have today. Tomorrow, it starts. The second day started before sunrise, and Ethan was already in position. Not because the schedule required it. The morning formation didn't begin until 5:15. But Ethan had been standing at the edge of the staging area since 4:50 in the dark, doing nothing that looked like anything, just a tired man standing where he was told to stand a little early, maybe because he had nowhere else to be. That was what it looked like. What it was different. In 22 minutes, he counted 3 things that didn't belong. First, a support vehicle parked on the Western Service Road had been there since yesterday afternoon and hadn't moved, which was unusual for a vehicle in that position during an active training week. Second, the light in the northeast corner office of the administration building, Colonel Whitaker's floor, had been on since at least 3 a.m., because Ethan had been awake at 3 a.m., and he'd noted it then, and it was still on now at 4:50, which meant someone had been in that office for most of the night. Third, Gallagher had come out of the barracks at 4:44 a.m., walked to the east perimeter fence, stood there for 90 seconds, looking at nothing, and walked back in. Ethan filed all 3 and did not move. At 5:08, Ryan Mitchell came out of the barracks and immediately began scanning the staging area the way he always did, cataloging, organizing, confirming his own position relative to everyone else. When he spotted Ethan already in formation, something moved across his face. Not respect. Something closer to recalculation. A man adjusting a number he thought he already knew. He walked to his own position without saying anything. That was new. Dolan arrived at 5:15 exactly, and the day began. The morning drill was close quarters team navigation, a series of timed sequences where candidates moved through a constructed environment in assigned pairs, making tactical decisions under time pressure and evaluating each other's choices in real time. It was designed to test something the obstacle runs couldn't test: how a man thought when he was tired, when the situation was unclear, and when the person beside him was a stranger he hadn't yet learned to read. Dolan assigned the pairs himself, reading from his clipboard without commentary. Mitchell and Webb, Foss and Hargrove, Carter and Gallagher. Ethan heard his name and Gallagher's in the same sentence and kept his expression exactly where it was. Neutral, slightly unfocused. The expression of a man who had heard his assignment and was thinking about nothing more complicated than where he needed to stand next. Internally, something sharpened to a point. Gallagher was assigned as his partner. 3 possibilities. Coincidence, which Ethan did not believe in professionally. Administrative meaning. Someone in the program logistics had generated this pairing through a standard process which was possible. Or deliberate meaning. Someone had chosen this pairing for a reason. He needed to know which one. He turned and found Gallagher already looking at him. Gallagher was 30 years old. Average. Build the kind of face that didn't distinguish itself. Not handsome. Not striking the face of someone who could stand in a crowd of 20 men, and not be the one you remembered afterward. Which was, Ethan knew, sometimes a skill, and sometimes just genetics. And the difference between the two was something you could usually determine by watching how a man moved through the spaces he occupied. Gallagher moved through spaces carefully. "Guess we're together," Gallagher said. "Guess so," Ethan said. They measured each other for a moment, the way 2 men measure each other when neither of them wants to be the one who looks like he's measuring. "You did ROTC?" Gallagher asked. The question was casual, conversational. The kind of question that was also a probe. "Who are you? How did you get here?" What's your story? No, Ethan said. Guard reserve. Something like that, Ethan said. Gallagher nodded slowly. His eyes moved to the bracelet on Ethan's wrist, then back up. Kid. Daughter, Ethan said. 8. Tough age to be away. Every age is tough to be away, Ethan said. Something moved in Gallagher's face fast, and then gone. It might have been something genuine. Ethan couldn't determine that yet, and he didn't try. You didn't rush a determination like that. You let it develop. Dolan gave the pairs their first sequence briefing, and the drill began. What happened over the next 90 minutes was something Ethan had planned for and prepared for, and still found in execution to be a more delicate operation than he'd anticipated. Because Gallagher was good, not special operations good. Not the kind of good that announced itself, but competent in a way that was slightly above what his file suggested. His file suggested a man of adequate physical ability and average tactical instinct. But watching him move through the navigation sequences, Ethan recalibrated. Gallagher made decisions quickly, and his decisions were usually correct. And when they were wrong, he didn't react with the defensiveness that characterized most people making errors under evaluation. He adjusted and moved forward. More importantly, he watched Ethan. Not obviously. Not in a way that the instructors would catalog, but in the way that Ethan himself watched people with peripheral attention, with patience, with the practiced quality of someone who had learned that the most useful observations came from not appearing to observe. By the end of the second navigation sequence, Ethan was certain Thomas Gallagher was not an average candidate who had been placed in this program through random administrative chance. He was also something else. Something that didn't fit cleanly into the frame Ethan had built over the past 3 weeks. He was scared. Not of the drill. Not of physical failure. Something deeper than that. Something that lived behind his eyes and was only visible for a fraction of a second, at certain moments when Dolan called a time warning, when another pair came unexpectedly close to their position, when Ethan himself moved in a way that Gallagher hadn't predicted. Scared. The kind of scared that came from knowing something you wished you didn't know. Ethan filed this and said nothing and continued to appear at all times like the weakest pair leader on the field. At the end of the third sequence, when the pairs were given 2 minutes of recovery time before the next briefing, Gallagher sat down on a low concrete barrier and looked at the ground and said very quietly, and without looking up, "You're not who you're pretending to be." Ethan sat down beside him. He took a breath that sounded tired. "I'm a 36-year-old candidate who's having a rough second day," he said. Gallagher looked up at him then. Direct level, the performance gone from his face in a way that was startling after 90 minutes of watching him maintain it. "I've been watching you since yesterday morning," Gallagher said. "The way you ran that 6 miles, you weren't struggling. You were performing struggling. And on that wall yesterday, I saw your grip. Just for a second before you softened it. That's a technical grip. That's trained." He paused. "Who are you?" Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Someone who needs 2 more days." 2 more days of what? Of being invisible. Gallagher stared at him. Before either of them could say anything else, Dolan's voice cut across the field calling the pairs back for the next briefing, and Gallagher stood up and became a candidate. Again, posture, recalibrated expression, neutralized, and walked back toward the formation. Ethan watched him walk and thought, "He's not with them. He's afraid of them." Then he thought, "Or he wants me to think that." Both possibilities required the same next move patience. Keep watching. Keep waiting. Don't act on incomplete information. He stood up and walked back to formation and stood beside Gallagher, and they did not speak again for the rest of the drill. But something had shifted between them. The particular shift that happened when 2 people who had each been pretending to be something they weren't looked at each other without the pretense just for a moment. You couldn't unhave that moment. It changed the temperature of the space between you. Ethan had not planned for Gallagher to see through him this quickly. He was going to have to adjust. The afternoon brought something harder. Dolan gathered the candidates in the central training room at 1300 hours, a low-ceilinged space with fluorescent lighting and a smell of rubber matting and chalk dust, and stood in front of them with his arms crossed and the particular expression of a man about to make an announcement that several people in the room were not going to enjoy. "This afternoon, we run scenario assessment," Dolan said. "Each candidate will be placed in a time-limited decision environment. One observer, one actor. Your job is to resolve the scenario using only what's available to you. You will be evaluated on decision speed, situational awareness, and conduct under pressure." He paused. "Conduct includes how you treat every person in the scenario. Rank does not protect you from a failing evaluation on conduct." He looked at the group. "Mitchell," he said, "you're first." Ryan stood up with the energy of a man for whom first was always the correct position. The scenario took place in an adjoining room. Ryan went in. The rest of the candidates sat and waited and listened to nothing because the room was well insulated, which was itself part of the design. Waiting without information was pressure of a particular kind. Ryan came out 12 minutes later. His face was controlled, but his jaw was slightly tighter than usual. He sat down and said nothing, and nobody asked him anything. "Carter," Dolan said, "you're next." Ethan went in. The room was small, 15 by 15, a table, 2 chairs, a locked cabinet, and a man in civilian clothes sitting in the chair opposite the empty one. On the table between them was a folder closed. The man in the civilian clothes was mid-40s with the quiet, specific stillness of someone who was very good at being in rooms like this one. Ethan recognized him. Not from the program files, from somewhere earlier, somewhere older. He didn't let that recognition surface on his face. He sat down. "Mr. Carter," the man said, "I'm going to present you with a situation. You have 8 minutes to resolve it. Ready?" "Yes," Ethan said. 12 hours ago, a member of your team passed sensitive operational information to an outside party. You have identified the member. You have physical evidence. Your commanding officer is not available. The information will be acted on in 4 hours. What do you do?" Ethan looked at the man. It was a standard scenario assessment question. It was also, word for word, a description of something that had happened to Ethan Carter 4 years ago on a mission in a country whose name did not appear in any report he'd ever been asked to sign. The odds of that being coincidence were not odds he was willing to calculate. He kept his face level. "I secure the member," Ethan said. "I protect the physical evidence. I go up the chain of command by every available route simultaneously, not sequentially, because sequential escalation creates delay that can be exploited. I document every action in real time, and I send a warning through a secondary channel to anyone in the operational path who might be affected." The man in the chair wrote something. "What if going up the chain of command puts the member in contact with the outside party?" "Then I don't go up the chain," Ethan said. "I go around it." "That would be insubordination." "Yes," Ethan said. "It would." The man looked at him steadily. "Most candidates want to resolve that tension," he said, "between following authority and doing what they know is right. Most candidates haven't been in a situation where that tension had real consequences," Ethan said. A pause. "Have you?" the man asked. Ethan met his eyes. 8 minutes is up," Ethan said. He stood, pushed the chair back under the table, and walked out. He sat back down in the waiting area and picked up an expression of mild tiredness and put it back on his face and wore it like a coat. Across the row, Ryan was watching him. Ryan had been watching him for 30 seconds before Ethan sat down. He'd seen Ethan come out of that room, and he'd seen something in Ethan's posture that he couldn't account for, that didn't fit the story Ryan had been telling himself since yesterday morning. The story of the tired old man with the shaking hand who didn't belong here. The story was developing a crack, not a big one. But Ryan was whatever else he was observant, and observation was now beginning to inconvenience him. "That was quick," Ryan said. 8 minutes, Ethan said. "That was the time. Most people went 15. I was finished at 8, Ethan said. Ryan looked at him for another moment. Then he looked away. The crack got a little wider. That evening, Dolan pulled Ethan aside. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention. Just a quiet word after the group had been dismissed, the kind of brief non-event that anyone watching would file as administrative routine. "Walk with me," Dolan said. They walked toward the eastern end of the compound, away from the barracks, at a pace that was not hurried. Dolan put his hands in his pockets, which was a gesture Ethan had not seen from him before. "You passed the scenario assessment," Dolan said, "by the highest margin in this cohort." "I don't know what the rubric is," Ethan said. "You don't need to," Dolan said. "I'm not telling you that so you feel good about yourself. I'm telling you because the observer in that room wanted me to know that you had the highest margin, and he wanted to know who flagged your application." Ethan said nothing. "Who flagged your application?" Dolan asked. "I applied through the standard process," Ethan said. Dolan looked at him sideways, and for the first time, Ethan saw something in the sergeant's face that was not the professional mask of an instructor managing a cohort. It was the face of a man who had been doing this work for a long time and had developed instincts that he trusted more than paperwork. "Son," Dolan said, using a word he had not used with any other candidate, "I've run 47 of these programs. I have seen every kind of candidate there is." He paused. "I have never had a candidate look as wrong as you look and test as right as you test. That's not an accident." Ethan kept his eyes forward. "I appreciate the evaluation, Sergeant," he said. Dolan stopped walking. Ethan stopped with him. "Foss and Gallagher," Dolan said very quietly. Ethan turned to look at him. Dolan's eyes were direct and level and careful. "I've been watching them since day one," he said. "I don't know what I'm seeing, but I know I don't like it." He studied Ethan's face. "I don't think you're here for the program." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm here to complete the program, Sergeant," Ethan said. Dolan looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded once slowly and turned and walked back toward the main building, and Ethan watched him go and revised his understanding of Master Sergeant Dolan significantly upward. He wasn't an obstacle. He wasn't a complication. He was potentially the one person in this compound who had been watching the same things Ethan was watching for different reasons, from a different angle. And he had just told Ethan that without saying it. Good. The third morning hit the cohort like a physical object. Dolan introduced the SERE elements at 0530. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. And the energy in the staging area changed immediately. SERE training had a specific weight to it that other drills didn't. Something about the name alone made men who had been performing easy confidence reassess their position in the universe. The first evolution was resistance to interrogation, not real interrogation. The program had limits and liabilities, but a sustained pressure-applied scenario designed to make candidates uncomfortable in the specific way that revealed what they did when comfort was removed and maintained. They ran them in sequence. The candidates who came back from the interrogation room looked different in varying degrees from the candidates who went in. Not broken. Nobody broke in a training scenario, at least not visibly, but recalibrated as if they had discovered something about themselves that they hadn't known before and were still in the process of filing it. Ryan came back from his session and sat down with his forearms on his knees and stared at the floor for 3 minutes straight, which was the longest Ethan had seen him go without speaking since they'd arrived. Gallagher came back from his session and sat back down beside Ethan and stared at the wall across from them, and after about a minute said very quietly without moving his head, "They asked me about you." Ethan did not react visibly. "What kind of question?" "How you perform under pressure. Whether you've said anything outside the standard candidate interaction. Whether I thought you were there for a different reason than the one on your application." The room was still around them. Other candidates focused on their own recovery, their own recalibrations. Nobody was paying attention to the quiet man with the shaking hand and the candidate beside him having a conversation at a volume just above the threshold of audibility. "What did you tell them?" Ethan asked. I told them you seemed like a tired dad trying to prove something. Gallagher paused. Which is what you want everyone to think. And what do you think? Gallagher turned his head and looked at him directly. I think whoever's asking those questions doesn't want you here. And I think whatever reason they have for not wanting you here is connected to why I'm here. Another pause. His voice, which had been controlled, developed a slight roughness. I didn't volunteer for this program, he said. I was told to be here. Ethan looked at him. Who told you? Ethan asked. Gallagher's jaw worked for a moment. The question had landed somewhere real. A man named Harwell, he said. Department of Defense Administrative Contractor. He told me this program was a standard operational assessment, and my participation was required as part of my current assignment. What's your current assignment? Logistics oversight for special operations support contracts. Gallagher looked back at the wall. He told me I was here to observe and report. He didn't say observe and report on what. He just said, watch everyone, and every 2 days I send a summary to an encrypted contact address. Foss, Ethan said. Gallagher closed his eyes briefly. Foss is doing the same thing. We didn't know about each other until the second day. He found me. A pause. He's more comfortable with it than I am. Ethan thought about the man in the civilian clothes in the assessment room. The scenario question that had described word for word a mission that didn't officially exist. He thought about the light in the administration building that had been on since 3 a.m. He thought about a name, Harwell. He didn't know that name. He knew the people above that name and the network around it, and he knew what that network had done. And he knew that if Harwell had placed 2 observers inside this specific program at this specific time, the timeline Foss had mentioned in the mess hall, it's been moved up, was not about an operational assessment. It was about something that was already in motion. How do you send the summaries? Ethan asked. Encrypted email, dead drop address, changed every cycle. Has Foss sent his yet for this cycle? Gallagher looked at him. Last night. After lights out. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Gallagher, he said, in the next 48 hours, someone is going to do something to end this program early. Not suspend it. End it. And when that happens, whatever they're protecting is going to move, and once it moves, it becomes very hard to locate. He kept his voice at the same volume, the same tone, nothing that would catch in the ambient noise of the room as unusual. I need one thing from you. Gallagher was very still. Don't send the next summary, Ethan said. A long silence. If I don't send it. Gallagher said Foss sends one for both of us and flags that I've gone dark. Yes, Ethan said. Which means they'll know something changed. Yes, Ethan said. Which means they might move faster. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe they move exactly when I need them to move. Gallagher stared at the wall. His hands flat on his thighs, pressed down slightly, the unconscious physical gesture of a man steadying himself. Who are you? He asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit for a moment, the way you let something sit when the answer is larger than the container. The question came in. Someone who lost people, he said finally, and hasn't finished finding out why. Gallagher looked at him one more time. Something in his face had changed. The calculation that had been running behind his eyes since that first morning had arrived at a result that was costing him something to accept. Then he looked forward again. I won't send it, he said. Ethan nodded once, barely visible. 2 rows ahead, Ryan Mitchell was watching them, not with suspicion, not yet. With the confused attention of a man whose story about the world was being revised faster than he could keep up with. The old man with the shaking hand was having a quiet conversation with another candidate after the most demanding evolution of the week. And something about that conversation, the quality of it, the stillness in it, the way neither man was performing anything, was producing in Ryan Mitchell the first genuine unease he'd felt since arriving at Fort Liberty. He opened his mouth to say something, and then Dolan called the next name for the interrogation room, and Ryan looked away, and Ethan looked forward, and Gallagher pressed his hands down on his thighs one more time and breathed out. 36 hours, Ethan thought. 36 hours until the final assessment. 36 hours to let the picture finish developing. He sat in the room with 20 other candidates, and he breathed at the pace of a man who was tired and nothing more, and he thought about Lily's dream, the open field, the people who couldn't see him, and then all at once everyone seeing him at the same time. And he thought about the card over his chest, 2 words in purple crayon, and he thought about 4 names he kept in a place inside himself that had no language attached to it, only wait. Not yet. But soon. He could feel it converging, the way you felt weather coming before the sky showed it something in the pressure, something in the way the air moved, something that every person who had survived the things Ethan Carter had survived learned to recognize, not as intuition, but as calculation. So fast, it felt like instinct. Something was about to break. He just needed to be in the right position when it did. 36 hours became 24 faster than Ethan expected. He woke at 2:47 in the morning to the sound of someone moving in the barracks with the particular careful quietness of someone who did not want to be heard moving. That kind of quiet was louder than noise to a man who had spent years listening for it. Ethan lay still, eyes open in the dark, breathing at the pace of sleep, and tracked the sound by its source and its pattern. Bunk 7, far end of the room. Foss. The movement lasted 40 seconds. Then it stopped. Then the barrack settled back into the ambient sounds of 22 men in various stages of sleep, and Ethan lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Gallagher had told him. Foss sends one for both of us and flags that I've gone dark. Which meant Foss had known within hours that Gallagher had stopped reporting and had sent exactly the kind of alert that Ethan had known would go out, and someone on the receiving end of that alert had now been awake long enough to have concerns. The question was what those concerns would produce and how fast. Ethan waited 10 minutes. Then he got up dressed in the dark without sound and went to the latrine at the end of the corridor, which was the only place in the barracks with a reason to be at 3 in the morning that didn't require an explanation. He stood at the sink and ran cold water over his hands and looked at himself in the mirror. He looked like what he was supposed to look like, tired, older than the other candidates, a man running slightly on empty. He also looked like a man who was 36 hours from either finishing this or failing it permanently, and who understood in his body, and not just his mind, what failure here would cost. He thought about the 4 names. He said them in his head in the order he always said them, the order they had died, which was the only order that was real. Marcus, Devin, Chen, Ortiz. Then he turned off of the water and went back to his bunk and lay down and waited for morning. It came at 0500, the way mornings at Fort Liberty always came, without ceremony or softness. But something was different from the moment Ethan stepped into the staging area. He felt it before he identified it, a change in atmospheric pressure, not physical, but social. The feeling of a space in which several people knew something that the room as a whole didn't know yet. Dolan was already there, which was slightly early. 2 men Ethan hadn't seen before were standing near the administration building. Civilian clothes, the specific posture of men who had authority, they were not displaying, which was itself a display of a different kind of authority. One of them was on a phone. The other was watching the candidates file into formation with the flat attentiveness of someone conducting an assessment that had nothing to do with the training program. Ethan found his position and stood in it and did not look at the 2 men again. Beside him in the next position, Gallagher arrived and stood at attention and said nothing. But his breathing was slightly elevated, and when Ethan glanced at his hands, Gallagher's right thumb was pressing against the side of his index finger, with the rhythmic pressure of a man managing something internal that he didn't have another outlet for. He'd seen the 2 men too. Ryan arrived, took his position on the far flank, and immediately found the 2 men with his eyes. He looked at them for 2 seconds, then looked at Dolan, then looked at Ethan in that sequence, and something about that sequence told Ethan that Ryan was connecting things he hadn't been connecting before. Not accurately, not yet. But the raw material of a more accurate understanding was accumulating. Dolan addressed the formation at 0513. Final assessment begins at 0800, he said. Full tactical obstacle course. Live evaluation. Every candidate runs. Scores are cumulative from the week. Today's evaluation carries 40% of your total. He paused. The pause had weight. Before we begin the morning preparation period, I have an administrative announcement. At the request of the Program Oversight Committee, candidate Gallagher and candidate Foss will report to the administration building at 0600 for a supplemental evaluation review. The words were bureaucratic. They were designed to sound routine. They were not routine. Ethan felt Gallagher go completely still beside him. Foss 3 rows over didn't move at all, which was itself a kind of movement, the movement of a man who had been expecting something and had just heard it arrive. Ryan was frowning now. He couldn't locate the source of the wrongness he was sensing, but the wrongness itself was registering. Dolan dismissed the formation to preparation, and Ethan moved with the group toward the equipment area, and he thought quickly, with the compressed precision of a man doing real-time calculation under time pressure. Gallagher goes to that meeting at 0600, and he doesn't come back to the assessment floor with the same freedom of movement he has right now. Foss goes to that meeting and confirms that Gallagher stopped reporting and that the flag he sent was accurate. Which means whoever is at the end of that encrypted contact address now knows that something changed in this program, and they are going to make a decision based on that knowledge before 800. He had less time than 36 hours. He had less time than he'd thought this morning. He had, by his estimate, about 2 hours. He pulled Gallagher aside at 0530 in the equipment room between 2 rows of gear lockers, where the ambient noise of 20 men preparing for a physical assessment covered the conversation. "Don't go to that meeting," Ethan said. Gallagher stared at him. "If I don't go, they pull me from the assessment." "Yes." "That ends my participation in the program." "Yes." "And if I'm pulled from the program, I go back to my regular assignment, which puts me back in contact with Harwell, which—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Which is exactly where they want me." "I know," Ethan said. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "Go to the meeting," Ethan said. "Tell them exactly what I told you not to tell them, which is that you identified me as more than I appear to be. Tell them I confronted you. Tell them I asked you not to report." Gallagher looked at him like he'd suggested something insane. "That burns you completely." "It gives them what they think they want," Ethan said. "And it gives me something I need." "Which is what?" "Time," Ethan said. "And a reason for them to wait until the assessment to move. Because if they think I'm about to be exposed on the assessment floor, they wait. They watch. They want to see what I do. They don't know what I know, and they need to find out before they act." He looked at Gallagher steadily. "Give them something that makes them hesitate. Hesitation is all I need." Gallagher was very quiet for a moment. The lockers around them were cold metal, and the room smelled like rubber and chalk, and the particular anxiety of men preparing to be tested. Somewhere behind them, Ryan was telling someone loudly to check their harness twice, which was actually useful advice delivered in the voice of a man who needed everyone to know it was his advice. "If this goes wrong," Gallagher said. "I know," Ethan said. "I mean, if this really goes wrong." "I know," Ethan said again. "I've had things go really wrong before. I know what it looks like. This isn't that." Gallagher looked at him with the expression of a man who was choosing to believe something that he wasn't fully certain of, which was the most honest expression Ethan had seen on anyone's face all week. "Okay," Gallagher said. He went to the meeting at 0600. Ethan went to the preparation area and began running movement drills with the other candidates, and he was terrible at them, and nobody was surprised, and Ryan looked at him twice with that same new unease that had been building since the day before, but still hadn't resolved into anything Ethan needed to manage yet. At 6:48, Gallagher came back. He looked different. Not visibly shaken, he was maintaining the surface, but underneath it something had been compressed the way a man looks when he has said things in a room that he cannot unsay, and is now living in the aftermath of that. He walked past Ethan without making eye contact, and joined the preparation group. 2 minutes later, he came past again close enough that his shoulder almost touched Ethan's, and said without slowing or looking at him, "They're sending someone to the floor, civilian observer. He'll be there for the assessment." He kept walking. Ethan continued the drill he was running, which he was doing wrong on purpose, and thought civilian observer at the assessment, which meant they weren't going to move before the floor, which meant the hesitation he'd asked Gallagher to buy him had worked, which meant everything was going to happen on the course. He had planned for this possibility. He had not planned to be grateful for it. But here, in the sharp morning of the third day, with his window compressing by the minute, the fact that it was all going to happen in the open in front of witnesses on a recorded assessment floor, where every action was logged and time-stamped, was the best possible version of what he'd been building toward. He thought of something his team leader Marcus had said once in a different country, in a much worse situation than this one. The only time you have complete information is after it's over. You work with what you've got, and you stay fast. He stayed fast. At 7:45, 15 minutes before the assessment began, Foss walked directly over to where Ethan was standing and stopped in front of him. This was new. This was not the careful oblique approach of a man conducting surveillance. This was direct, which meant Foss had been told something in his 0600 meeting that had changed his operating posture. Direct meant one thing: he'd been authorized. "Carter," Foss said. Ethan looked at him. Foss was compact, sharp-eyed, with the specific quality of a man who had decided that the situation required a different kind of pressure and had chosen to apply it himself rather than wait. "You've got the wrong idea about what's happening here," he said. His voice was low, conversational, designed not to carry. "I'm telling you that as a courtesy." "What idea do I have?" Ethan asked. "That whatever you think you found connects to whatever you came here looking for." Foss tilted his head slightly. "It doesn't. You're in the wrong place." "That's good to know," Ethan said. He matched Foss's conversational tone exactly. "I'll keep that in mind during the assessment." Foss looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his eyes. Not uncertainty, but the recalculation of a man who had applied pressure and found the target wasn't moving the way pressure targets moved. "The man who sent you," Foss said. "Whatever he told you, he doesn't have the full picture." "Nobody sent me," Ethan said. "Then you're even more exposed than we thought," Foss said. He walked away. Ethan watched him go and noted 3 things in quick succession. Foss had confirmed there was a we. Foss had suggested Ethan had been sent by someone, which meant they had a theory about his origin that was partially wrong. And Foss had said the man who sent you, without considering the possibility that no man had sent him, that Ethan had come here entirely on his own, entirely off record, with no institutional support and no extraction plan, and nothing behind him except 4 dead men and an 8-year-old girl who was currently at school drawing pictures with purple crayon. That was information. That was very useful information. Ryan Mitchell had watched the exchange between Ethan and Foss from 10 feet away. He'd heard none of it. Ethan had made sure of that. But he'd seen the posture of it, and now he walked over to Ethan, with his arms slightly out from his sides. The unconscious physical posture of a man who has arrived at a confrontation he has not fully decided to have yet. "What was that?" Ryan asked. "Conversation," Ethan said. "Between you and Foss." Ryan's voice had lost its performance register entirely now. This was a different voice, quieter, more real. "You barely talk to anyone. You've barely talked to anyone all week. And then 2 days from the end you're having conversations with Foss and Gallagher that make people stand differently when they're over." Ethan looked at him. "I don't know what you think is going on here," Ryan said. "But I'm asking you straight. Something isn't right about this program, and I think you know what it is." This was the moment Ethan had been deciding about since the first morning. Not whether to tell Ryan anything he wasn't going to tell Ryan anything specific, but whether to give him enough to use his instincts in the right direction, because Ryan Mitchell on the assessment floor this morning was going to be either a liability or a resource, and the difference between those 2 things was a single conversation. "I think you should run the assessment the way you've run everything this week," Ethan said. "Full effort, high visibility. Trust your instincts when something looks wrong. Ryan stared at him. That's not an answer. That's the only answer I've got for you right now, Ethan said. Another moment. Ryan was processing, running the calculation, trying to fit Ethan Carter into a shape that made sense. Then he said very quietly, "Are you actually struggling in this program?" Ethan held his gaze. "No," he said. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had settled in his face. Not understanding exactly, but the acceptance of uncertainty from a man who had spent his entire life being certain. It sat on him strangely, but it sat. "Okay," Ryan said. He walked back to his position. Dolan called the assessment at 800 exactly. The tactical obstacle course was a half-mile of engineered physical and cognitive pressure walls, water elements, rope systems, load, carries a team extraction sequence at the 2/3 mark, and a final individual sprint with a decision task at the end. It was designed to take a candidate's full capability and apply it until something gave. The scoring was live, called by 3 assessors stationed at intervals along the course, with a 4th doing the final evaluation at the end point. The civilian observer. A man in dark slacks and a gray jacket who stood near the start position with a tablet and the flat, careful attention of someone cataloging information, arrived at 07:52 and positioned himself at the edge of the course, where he had sightlines to the full run. Ethan noted his position. He noted which direction the man's attention moved when the candidate staged at the start. He noted that the man's eyes went to Ethan first and stayed for 3 full seconds before moving on. They knew exactly who they were watching. Good. The first group staged and ran. Ryan went in the second group, and he ran it the way Ryan Mitchell ran everything, with total commitment, high visibility. The particular grace of a genuinely gifted physical specimen who had also worked very hard. And it was something to see. It was genuinely something to see. And Ethan watched it and felt something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite something else, just a clear recognition of ability in another person. Ryan finished the final sprint and hit the decision task, a locked panel with a 4-choice sequence that had to be solved under time pressure, and got it in 11 seconds, which was fast. And the assessor called his score, and the group around the staging area responded the way they always responded to Ryan Mitchell performing well, with the sound of people who had invested in a narrative and were watching it pay off. Ethan's group staged at 0841. He stood at the start line with 5 other candidates and felt the morning air against his face and the weight of his pack, and the familiar pre-action stillness that he'd felt on 50 different starting lines in 6 different countries, the stillness that had nothing to do with calm, and everything to do with compression. Everything gathered inward and held. He glanced once at the civilian observer. The man was watching him. Tablet down. Just watching. Dolan said go. For the first 40 seconds, Ethan ran it wrong. Same as the wall, same as the 6 mile, same as every drill, all week, slightly behind, slightly labored, slightly wrong, in all the ways that invited exactly the kind of attention he had been inviting since day one. Then came the first wall. The first candidate reached it. Martinez, 26, strong climber, and went up clean. The second went up behind him. The third candidate, Holloway, 24, went for the rope and missed his grip and came down hard on his left knee, and the sound he made wasn't the sound of someone who would be getting up immediately. Ethan was the 4th to reach the wall. He stopped. Every instinct trained into him over 15 years said, you stop here, you lose the cover, you break position. The observer sees something different. Everything you've built this week is in service of what comes after this course, and breaking cover now costs you that. He stopped anyway. He dropped his pack and knelt beside Holloway, who was trying to get up, and couldn't his face the gray-white color of someone managing serious pain. Stay down, Ethan said. He ran his hands along Holloway's knee with the fast, specific efficiency of a man who had assessed injuries in conditions where a wrong assessment had immediate consequences. Patella. Medial ligament. Nothing structural, but enough to end this run and possibly the program. I can make it, Holloway said through his teeth. You can't, Ethan said. And if you try, you make it worse. He looked up and caught the eye of an assessor 20 yards away and made a clear, direct signal, not frantic, not dramatic, just precise, that communicated medical attention needed without creating a scene around it. The assessor moved immediately. Ethan stood, picked up his pack, and went up the wall. What happened then was something that could not be fully explained later, only described. He went up the wall in 4 seconds. Not the 22 seconds of the previous assessment. Not the careful, effortful, slightly wrong performance of a man managing decline. 4 seconds clean the rope, paying through his hands with the automatic efficiency of a movement that had been done so many times it had left the category of skill and entered the category of reflex. He was at the top before the assessor watching that station had fully registered that he'd started. On the other side, he landed and ran. He ran the way he had not run all week. Not faster than Ryan. Ryan had genetics and youth, and years of dedicated training going for him, and those things were real but differently, with a different architecture. The run of a man who had learned to move in environments where being noticed was a liability, where efficiency mattered more than speed, where saving energy at the right moments was its own kind of performance. He hit the rope traverse and crossed it in a single continuous motion. He hit the load carry and took the weight with the specific posture of a man who had carried heavier things in worse conditions. He hit the team extraction sequence where 2 candidates had to work together to move a weighted litter across a 20-yard obstacle section, and his partner was Webb, the red-haired candidate from the first morning, and Webb looked at Ethan when he arrived at the station, and then looked at him again differently, and didn't say anything, just took his side of the litter and moved. They ran the extraction sequence in the fastest time recorded that day. At the 2/3 mark, passing the assessor's station, Ethan caught the man's expression as he called the time, and the expression said something the man hadn't intended to say out loud. Something between surprise and the recalibration of a professional who did not recalibrate often. The civilian observer was moving along the edge of the course now. He was no longer watching from the start position. He was following the run, tracking Ethan, specifically the tablet back in his hands, and his eyes moving between it and the course with the urgent attention of a man updating a document in real time. Ethan saw him and ran faster, not because speed was the point, because what happened in the next 60 seconds was the most important 60 seconds of the last 4 years, and he needed to be running. He needed to be in motion. He needed his body to be doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing so that his mind could do what it needed to do. He had placed Foss in his mental map of the course from the earlier groups. Foss had staged in the group ahead of Ethan's, which meant he was somewhere on the back end of the course in the final sprint section, either finishing or finished. At the entrance to the final sprint, a narrow lane between 2 structures that required candidates to pass single file. Ethan was moving fast enough that he came up behind 2 candidates who had slowed. He went around the left edge, technically outside the lane margin, which was a scoring deduction he was willing to take. And as he came back into line, he passed directly beside a man in a dark jacket who was standing at the edge of the structure. Not Foss, the civilian observer, who had moved from the course edge to this interior position, which was not a spectator position, which was a position you took when you were about to do something, not watch something. Ethan ran past him. In the 3 seconds that they were in proximity, the man said something. Not loud, almost under his breath. But Ethan's hearing had been calibrated by years of listening in conditions where the sounds that mattered were always the quiet ones. "Stand down, Carter," the man said. "This is bigger than what you think it is." Ethan ran. He hit the final decision panel at the end of the sprint and stopped breathing hard, genuinely hard for the first time all week, and looked at the 4-choice sequence under the timer. His hands moved. 8 seconds. He stepped back from the panel as the assessor called his time, and he turned around, and the civilian observer was standing 15 yards away, and he was not alone. Foss was beside him, and behind them both, standing at the edge of the assessment floor, was a man Ethan hadn't seen in 4 years. Tall, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had once been handsome, in a way that power had since replaced with something harder, something that had stopped needing to be liked. Colonel Adrian Harwell, not a DOD contractor. A colonel. Ethan stood very still. The name had been in the documents. The name had been at the end of every chain of administrative decisions he'd traced for 3 weeks. The name belonged to the voice on a recorded communication from a mission debrief that Ethan had listened to 78 times in the past 4 years. Because the voice in the recording was giving information to someone outside the command structure 8 hours before 4 of his people died. He had known the name. He had not known the face. He had not known the rank. Colonel Adrian Harwell looked at Ethan Carter from 15 yards away, and for a moment, neither of them moved, and the assessment floor was full of people and noise and activity, and none of it reached either of them. Then Ryan Mitchell's voice cut through everything. "Hey," Ryan said. He was coming around the edge of the finish area, still flushed from his own run, and he'd seen something the civilian observer, Foss, the man Ethan was locked in a stair with, and Ryan's instincts, which were good even when his judgment wasn't, had fired. "What's going on?" No one answered him, and in that silence, Harwell made a decision. He nodded at Foss, and Foss started moving toward Ethan. What happened next happened fast. Foss covered the 15 yards quickly, and when he reached Ethan, he didn't stop. The way you stopped for a conversation. He kept moving and used his momentum, and his hand went to Ethan's left arm, with the grip of a man who intended the grip to communicate something authority control, a physical instruction to move in a specific direction without making a scene. His hand caught Ethan's sleeve, and the sleeve tore. Not all of it. A section, maybe 3 inches of fabric at the inside of the forearm, where the material had been stressed by a week of drills, and the grip found the weakest point, and the weakest point gave. The tattoo was suddenly visible. Not partially, fully. The black snake in its 7 coils, precise and deliberate, the 3 numbers beneath it in the specific typeface of a unit designation. 731. Foss let go of his arm immediately. The assessment floor didn't go silent the way a room went silent when someone said something shocking. It went silent the way a room went silent when something happened that nobody had language for, yet a gradual spreading quiet that moved outward from the 2 men at the center of it like something physical. Ethan didn't look at his arm. He looked at Harwell. Harwell was looking at the tattoo. His face was doing something Ethan had not anticipated. Not the guilt of a man caught, not the calculation of a man deciding how to manage a situation. Something older than that. Something that looked for one unguarded moment like recognition. Like a man seeing something he had told himself did not exist anymore, and finding out he was wrong. Then footsteps. Fast, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who had been watching from distance and was now crossing distance quickly. Colonel James Whitaker came through the edge of the assessment floor and stopped. He looked at Ethan's arm. He looked at the tattoo. He looked at the 3 numbers. And Ethan watched the blood leave Colonel Whitaker's face in a single smooth movement, the way color leaves something when a light is turned off. Whitaker reached up and removed his helmet. Not slowly, not dramatically. Just the single, quiet action of a man whose training had given him exactly one response for exactly this situation, and whose body had executed it before his mind fully caught up. He saluted. The assessment floor was completely silent. "Operator Carter," Whitaker said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "We were told your entire team was gone." Ethan looked at him. Behind Whitaker, Ryan Mitchell had stopped moving entirely. He was standing with his weight slightly forward, the posture of a man in the middle of a thought that was dismantling something he'd believed completely. Harwell, 15 yards away, had not moved. Foss had taken 3 steps back. Ethan looked at Whitaker for a moment. Then he looked past him at Harwell. He said it quietly. He said it to Whitaker, and he said it to Harwell, and he said it to the assessment floor and everyone on it, and he said it to 4 names he kept in a place inside himself that had no other language. "Sometimes ghosts survive, Colonel," he said. And the morning held that sentence for a long moment, suspended before the world began moving again. But Harwell was already taking a step backward, and Ethan was already watching him do it. And it was not over. Not yet. Not even close. Harwell took 1 step back, then another. The movement was subtle, not a retreat, not yet just the instinctive backward lean of a man whose body had registered danger before his mind had finished categorizing it. But Ethan had spent 15 years reading the difference between a man who was startled and a man who was calculating his exit, and what he saw in Harwell's posture in that moment was not surprise. It was the specific stillness of a man deciding which direction to run. Ethan moved first. Not toward Harwell, toward Whitaker. He covered the distance in 4 steps and put himself directly in the colonel's line of sight, close enough that the conversation that followed would not carry to the edges of the assessment floor, where 22 candidates and 3 assessors were standing in the particular frozen silence of people who had witnessed something they did not yet have a framework to understand. "Colonel," Ethan said. His voice was level. "I need you to secure that man before he leaves this compound." Whitaker was still holding his salute. He dropped it slowly, the way a man moved when his body was operating on reflex and his mind was 3 seconds behind. "Carter, how long have you been the program records have you as?" "I know what the records say," Ethan said. "I wrote them." "Sir, I need you to secure Harwell right now. If he gets to a phone or leaves this compound in the next 4 minutes, we lose the window." Whitaker looked past Ethan at Harwell, and something happened in the colonel's face, the transition from shock to function, the particular recalibration of a career military officer whose training was deeper than his confusion. He'd seen the tattoo. He knew the unit. Whatever he didn't yet know about how Ethan had come to be standing on his assessment floor, he knew enough. He turned to the senior assessor standing 8 feet away. "Daniels, nobody leaves this compound. That's a direct order. Nobody through the gates. Nobody on a phone outside this building. Do you understand me?" Daniels had been in the military for 20 years. He understood a direct order. "Yes, sir." He was already moving. Harwell saw Daniels move and made his decision. He didn't run. Running was too obvious, too readable, too much of a confession. Instead, he turned with the practiced authority of a senior officer and walked deliberately, as if he had somewhere to be, and the reason for being there was entirely legitimate, toward the eastern edge of the assessment floor, where the service road ran along the compound perimeter. Ryan Mitchell stepped into his path. It wasn't planned. It wasn't coordinated. Ryan hadn't been told anything, and didn't know anything specific but his instincts, the same instincts that made him the loudest man in every room, the same instincts that had been misfiring all week because they were aimed at the wrong target. Those instincts had just found something real to attach to. And Ryan Mitchell with his instincts properly aimed was a different proposition than Ryan Mitchell with them misdirected. He didn't touch Harwell. He just stood there, in the path. 210 pounds of former Division I athlete and Ranger-trained soldier, and he stood with his arms slightly out and his feet at shoulder width, and he looked at Harwell with the flat, direct look of a man who had decided to be an obstacle. "Sir," Ryan said politely, firmly, the way you said something when you wanted it to sound like a request and mean something entirely different. "I think you should stay where you are." Harwell looked at him. The authority he'd been wearing like a coat was still there, but it had developed a tremor in it, the first visible crack in the surface of a man who had spent a long time being beyond reach. "Step aside, candidate," Harwell said. "I don't think I will," Ryan said. Foss moved from the left. He covered the ground between himself and Ryan quickly, and there was intention in the movement. Not the intention of a man going to have a conversation, but the intention of a man who had been given a job and was attempting to complete it. He reached for Ryan's arm. Ryan turned and caught Foss's wrist with both hands, and the movement was so fast and so clean that 2 candidates nearby took an involuntary step back. Foss pulled. Ryan held. For a moment, it was a question of physics. 2 men roughly equal in size, one of whom had not been performing weakness all week. Ethan came across the floor at a run, not at Foss, at Harwell. Because Harwell, with Ryan occupied, and Daniels still moving, and Whitaker still processing, had found a gap and was moving through it, no longer walking. Now something between a walk and a run, heading for the service road, where the vehicle that had been sitting unmoved for 2 days was parked. Ethan hit him from the left side. Not a tackle, too much impact risk at his angle. Too much potential for Harwell to turn it into something that changed the visual of what was happening. Instead, he stepped directly into Harwell's path and planted, and the collision was chest to chest at near running pace, and both men staggered, and then Ethan had his forearm across Harwell's chest and his weight behind it, and Harwell's back met the chain-link fence at the edge of the assessment floor. The whole compound heard it. Harwell grabbed Ethan's arm, the same arm, the torn sleeve, the tattoo fully visible, and for a second, the two men were locked together face to face close enough that Ethan could see the lines in Harwell's face and the thing behind his eyes that he had been reading from a distance for 4 years but had never seen up close. It wasn't guilt exactly. Guilt had a quality of regret to it, a quality of wishing things had gone differently. What Ethan saw in Harwell's eyes was something colder than that. The settled, durable conviction of a man who had made a calculation years ago and had spent the intervening time finding reasons why the calculation had been correct. "You don't know what you're doing," Harwell said. His voice was controlled. "Even now, even here, there are things inside this that you were never cleared for." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Ethan said. "I've been doing it for 4 years. The mission that team was running. I know what the mission was," Ethan said. "I was on it." "Then you know why it couldn't be." Harwell stopped. Couldn't be what Ethan said. Survived, reported, investigated. He held the man against the fence and kept his voice at the same level it had been all week. Quiet controlled the voice of a man who had made peace with something that still cost him everything. "Say it. Say what it couldn't be." Harwell said nothing. 4 men, Ethan said. Marcus Webb. Not the candidate in this program, a different Marcus Webb, my team leader, 33 years old from Galveston, Texas. Devin Park. Michael Chen. Ray Ortiz. He said each name the way he always said them. The order they died. The only order that was real. "Say their names." Harwell's jaw was tight. "This isn't the place. This is exactly the place," Ethan said. "Because you picked this place. You put your people in this program, in this compound, watching this assessment floor. Because someone told you I was coming, and you thought you could manage it before it became something you couldn't control." He felt Harwell's weight shift and tightened his forearm. "It's already something you can't control." Whitaker arrived behind Ethan and spoke over his shoulder. "Carter, step back." Ethan looked at him. "Step back," Whitaker said again, and his voice had the authority of a man who had made the transition fully, now who was no longer in shock and was entirely in command. "I have him." Ethan held Harwell's gaze for one more second. Then he stepped back. 2 of Daniel's people had arrived and flanked Harwell and the colonel. The other colonel, the one who had just had a Special Forces ghost pin him to a chain-link fence in front of 22 training candidates, straightened his jacket with the dignity of a man preserving something that had already left him. "You have no jurisdiction," Harwell said to Whitaker. "This program operates under DOD oversight authority, and I am—" "You are going to walk with these men to my command center," Whitaker said. "And you are going to stay there until I make 3 phone calls, and then we will have a conversation about jurisdiction." His voice was the voice of a man who had commanded people for 20 years and had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Walk." Harwell walked. Foss had stopped fighting. At some point in the exchange at the fence, Ethan wasn't sure exactly when Foss had simply stopped. He was standing very still with Ryan's grip still loosely on his wrist, and the expression of a man who had just watched the load-bearing wall of a structure he'd been inside come down, and was now assessing whether the rest of it was going to follow. Ryan let go of Foss's wrist. He looked at Ethan. "What just happened?" Ryan said. "I'll explain what I can," Ethan said. "Later." Ryan stared at him. The week was moving behind his eyes, every drill, every conversation. Every moment he'd looked at Ethan Carter and seen exactly what Ethan had needed him to see. The accumulated recalibration of 7 days of completely wrong assumptions was happening in real time on Ryan Mitchell's face, and it was not a comfortable thing to watch, because Ryan was not a man who was comfortable being wrong. And what he was discovering right now was that he had been wrong in a way that mattered wrong in the specific direction of looking at a man and seeing diminishment where there was depth. You were never struggling, Ryan said. It wasn't a question. I was struggling with some things, Ethan said. Not the ones you saw. Ryan looked at the torn sleeve. At the tattoo. 731. He'd seen military tattoos before, had one himself, but he recognized the visual grammar of a unit designation, and he recognized that he did not recognize this one, and that the colonel of the compound had just saluted a training candidate because of it, and that somewhere in the space between those two facts was a story he didn't have access to yet. Is it over? Ryan asked. The part on this field is, Ethan said. He moved toward Whitaker's command center. The walk across the compound took 4 minutes. Ethan made the walk alone, and for those 4 minutes, he let himself feel the weight of the week drop incrementally from his shoulders. Not release, not relief, but the particular physical sensation of sustained performance, finally resting muscles, unclenching, that had been clenched since before he'd driven to Fort Liberty, since before he'd stood at the kitchen table in the dark, looking at a purple crayon card. He stopped once. In the middle of the compound between the assessment floor and the administration building. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out the folded card. He looked at it once at the purple letters and the gap-toothed stick figure, and then he folded it back along the same creases and put it back over his chest. Then he kept walking. Whitaker's command center was a room on the 3rd floor of the administration building. Not an office, more of an operational workspace with a long table and communications equipment and a quality of organized control that said a great deal about the man who used it. Harwell was already there when Ethan arrived, seated at one end of the table with Daniel's people flanking him, his jacket still precisely buttoned. His expression the careful blank of a man who had decided that his next words needed to be chosen more carefully than anything he'd said in years. Foss was at the other end, which told Ethan that Whitaker had separated them immediately. Good. Whitaker understood or had intuited that these two men needed different kinds of attention, and that mixing them before the information was contained would produce noise instead of clarity. Gallagher was not in the room. Ethan noted the absence and filed it. He'd asked about it later. Whitaker closed the door and stood at the head of the table and looked at Ethan for a long moment. The salute on the assessment floor had been reflex-trained reflex, but still reflex. This was the look of a man making a considered decision. Sit down, Carter, Whitaker said. Ethan sat. I'm going to ask you one question, Whitaker said, and I need one honest answer before we go further. Yes, sir. Who authorized this operation? Ethan looked at him. Nobody. Whitaker was very still. Nobody. I'm here as a private citizen, Ethan said. Everything I've done in the last 3 weeks, the application, the identity documentation, the program entry, I built it myself from resources I retained after my unit was dissolved. No agency authorization, no command sanction, no official support structure of any kind. The room was quiet. You ran a covert insertion into a military training program, Whitaker said carefully, with no official authorization for the purpose of investigating a 4-year-old betrayal alone as a private citizen. He said each phrase with the precise enunciation of a man who needed to hear the thing out loud to fully believe it. Yes, sir, Ethan said. Whitaker looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at Ethan. And what exactly did you find? Enough, Ethan said. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, not the pocket with the card, the other one, and withdrew a folded document. A single page dense with notations in small, precise handwriting. He put it on the table and slid it toward Whitaker. Timeline of administrative decisions over the past 4 years. 14 decision points, each one traceable to the same cluster of authorizing signatures. Cross-referenced with communications intercepts. Communications I retained from the original mission debrief that were never submitted to the official record because the official record was being managed by one of the signatories. He nodded toward Harwell. Him. Whitaker picked up the document. He read it with the focused attention of someone who read quickly and retained completely. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Harwell. Harwell had been watching this exchange with the stillness of a man who had run every available calculation and had not yet found one that came out in his favor, but who had not given up calculating. "Colonel Harwell," Whitaker said, "I'd like you to tell me what the Serpent Division was." A pause. "I'm not authorized to discuss classified program designations in an unsecured—" "This building is secured," Whitaker said. "And I'm not asking for a program briefing. I'm asking you to confirm that you know what that tattoo means." Another pause, longer. "Yes," Harwell said finally. "I know what it means." "And you know what Operator Carter's presence in this program means." Harwell looked at Ethan. The thing behind his eyes had shifted slightly. The settled conviction was still there, but something else had appeared beside it. Something that Ethan hadn't seen before, and took him a moment to identify. Fear. Not of Whitaker, not of the room. Of the document on the table, and what the document represented, and how many other documents might exist like it. "The mission 4 years ago was compromised," Harwell said. Each word was chosen. "The compromise was authorized at a level above my command." The room absorbed this. "Authorized," Ethan said. His voice was very quiet. "The intelligence that team was carrying would have ended careers at the highest levels of the command structure," Harwell said. "There were men who could not allow that intelligence to reach the official record. I was given a choice." He looked at Ethan directly for the first time since the fence. "I didn't kill your team, Carter. I removed their support. That's not the same thing." The quiet that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Ethan had ever sat in. He thought of Marcus Webb from Galveston, Texas. He thought of Devin Park, who had a daughter 2 years older than Lily. He thought of Michael Chen, who had been the funniest man Ethan had ever known, in a profession that didn't reward being funny. He thought of Ray Ortiz, who had given Ethan the mission briefing on the tarmac with one hand on his shoulder and said, "We get this right, and we go home." They hadn't gone home. "You removed their support," Ethan said. He heard his own voice from a distance, the way you heard your voice when something was happening that was too large for the normal human distance between event and reaction. In the middle of a live mission, in hostile territory, with 4 operators counting on extraction. "The decision was not mine alone," Harwell said. "I was given a direct—" "I know what you were given," Ethan said. "I know the name of every person who gave it to you. It's on that document." He nodded at the page in front of Whitaker. "And I know the name of the operation they were protecting, and I know why they were protecting it, and I know that it's been active for 4 years since my team died, because nobody survived to report it." His eyes stayed on Harwell. "Nobody except me." Harwell was breathing carefully. "The operation you're describing," Whitaker said to Ethan, "is it currently active?" "Yes," Ethan said. "That's why the timeline moved up. That's what Foss was reporting. They found out I was in the program and they accelerated an operation that had been scheduled for 3 weeks from now because they needed to move it before I could document the connection." Whitaker turned to Foss. "Candidate Foss, is that accurate?" Foss was sitting very still. The calculation that had been running behind his eyes all week had reached a different kind of result, now the kind that came when a man who had been operating on instructions looked up and saw what those instructions had actually been in service of. He was not, Ethan had concluded, a bad person. He was a man who had been given a job without being told what the job was really for, and had just found out in the worst possible way. "I was told the operation was a counterintelligence assessment," Foss said. His voice was flat. "I was told Carter was a compromised asset who had been running an unauthorized access operation inside military programs." "And Gallagher?" Whitaker asked. "Same briefing." Ethan thought so. Gallagher had been as deceived as Foss. What Gallagher had told him, the fear behind his eyes, the roughness in his voice when he talked about being told to be here, that had been real. He hadn't been afraid of being caught. He'd been afraid of what he was part of without knowing the full shape of it. "Where is Gallagher?" Ethan asked. "I had him secured in the briefing room on the 2nd floor," Whitaker said. "For his protection as much as anything else. He cooperated with me," Ethan said. He stopped reporting when I asked him to. Whatever consequences come out of this, that should be on the record. Whitaker nodded once. He picked up the document from the table and held it carefully the way you held something that had weight beyond its physical dimensions. I need to make those 3 phone calls I mentioned, he said. And then there are going to be people in this room who have much larger authority than I do and many more questions than I do. He looked at Ethan. You're going to need to walk through all of it. Everything. From the beginning. I know, Ethan said. It's going to take time. I know. Whitaker started toward the door, then stopped. He turned back. Carter, the application you submitted, the identity documentation, I'll account for all of it, Ethan said. That's not what I was going to say. Whitaker paused. He had the expression of a man choosing between the technically correct thing and the true thing, and choosing the true thing. I was going to say that the scenario assessment result you posted on day 2 was the highest score this program has recorded in 11 years, and your obstacle course time this morning with the assist on Holloway at the wall was the fastest adjusted score on this assessment cycle. He paused again. I just thought you should know that. He left. The room was quiet. Harwell sat at one end. Foss sat at the other. Ethan sat in the middle, the torn sleeve on his left arm, the tattoo fully visible. 7 coils around 3 numbers that had belonged to a unit that officially didn't exist, and 4 men who officially hadn't died, and he sat with his hands flat on the table and breathed. After a while, Harwell said, You did this alone. 4 years of building a case alone with no support structure while raising a child. Yes, Ethan said. Why didn't you go to an inspector general, a congressional oversight? Because the first signature on every administrative decision that buried this case is from a man who sits on the oversight committee, Ethan said. And the second signature is from his deputy chief of staff. The system that would investigate this is the system that covered it. That's why I needed physical evidence in an environment they didn't control. He looked at the document on the table. That's what I have. Harwell was quiet for a moment. You knew I'd be here, he said. You knew before you arrived. I suspected, Ethan said. I confirmed it on day 1. The vehicle on the service road. Among other things, Ethan said. Harwell looked at him with an expression that had finally shed its remaining layers of performance and arrived at something that might have been the man underneath all of it. Not the man Ethan would forgive, not the man he'd ever be able to think about without the weight of 4 names attached, but a man who was seeing clearly for possibly the first time in years. I need you to understand something, Harwell said. The people above me in this, they are not finished. What you have in that document gets the mechanism. It does not get the architecture. There are 3 men whose names are not on that page who built what I was maintaining. Ethan looked at him. Are you offering to give me names? Ethan said. I'm telling you that what you think you've finished today is not finished, Harwell said. If you walk out of here thinking it is, you're wrong, and the next version of this will be worse, and you won't see it coming the same way because they'll know your methods now. Tell me the names, Ethan said. A pause. Long. The kind of pause that contained a man doing the final accounting of a very long set of choices. When the people Whitaker called arrive, Harwell said, and they offer me whatever they're going to offer me to cooperate, I'll give them the names, all 3, and I'll give them the operation designation and the full timeline. He looked at Ethan. But I need something from you. I'm not in a position to offer you anything, Ethan said. I'm not asking for immunity, Harwell said. I'm asking you to tell them I cooperated, that's all. Just that I cooperated when it mattered. He paused. I know what I did. I'm not asking you to say otherwise. I'm asking you to say that when you had me against a fence and a colonel and 22 candidates as witnesses, I chose cooperation. Ethan looked at him for a long time. He thought of Marcus. He thought of the thing about judgment that Marcus had told him once in a country neither of them had officially been in under a sky that had no right being as beautiful as it was given what they'd been doing under it. Marcus had said the hardest call isn't the one you make in the field. It's the one you make after when the pressure's off and nobody's watching, and you have to decide what the truth costs you personally. If you give them what you said you'll give them, Ethan said, I'll tell them you cooperated. I'll tell them the truth of what happened in this room. That's all I can give you, and it's all I'm willing to give you. Harwell nodded. The door opened and Whitaker came back in, and behind him were two men in suits who had the look of people who traveled at the speed of institutional authority when it was moving fast, and the room changed the way rooms changed when the people in them stopped being the highest-ranking people in the building. One of the suited men looked at Ethan. "Operator Carter," he said. He didn't offer his name. He didn't need to. "We have a lot of ground to cover." "Yes," Ethan said. "We do." He sat forward and put both hands on the table and began. Outside on the assessment floor, Ryan Mitchell was sitting on a concrete barrier watching the administration building. He hadn't left. None of the candidates had left. They were scattered around the edges of the assessment floor in small groups, speaking quietly, or not speaking at all, doing the slow work of reassembling an understanding of the week they'd just lived through. Webb Marcus. Webb, the red-haired candidate, 24 years old, sat down beside Ryan after a while. "You think he's okay?" Webb said. Ryan looked at the administration building. At the third-floor window where a light was on, and had been on for the last 90 minutes. "Yeah," Ryan said. He said it with a certainty that surprised him, given that he had no specific basis for it, other than everything he'd watched Ethan Carter do all week. "Yeah, I think he's going to be okay." He sat and watched the light in the window and said nothing else. And in the command center on the third floor, Ethan Carter told everything he knew to two men who had the authority to do something with it, his voice steady and his hand still, and the torn sleeve on his left arm showing 7 coils around 3 numbers that had waited 4 years for this room. He told it all, and he did not stop until he was done. The debrief lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes. Ethan knew the exact duration, because he counted it the way he counted everything, not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the automatic precision of a man whose relationship with time had been shaped by situations where the difference between 6 hours and 7 hours was the difference between outcomes that mattered. He sat at that table in Whitaker's command center and talked, and the two suited men listened and recorded, and occasionally asked questions that told him by their specificity exactly how much they already knew, and exactly how much they hadn't known until now. The answer to the second part was more than Ethan had expected. They knew about Harwell. They had known about Harwell for longer than Ethan had, in fact, had been building a parallel case from a different angle, using institutional tools that Ethan hadn't had access to, and had gotten further in some directions and far less far in others. What they hadn't had was what Ethan had: the communications intercepts from the original mission debrief, retained at personal risk, carried for 4 years, in encrypted storage, on a device that had never been connected to any network that touched the official record. The physical link between the administrative decision chain and the operational outcome on the night 4 men died. The first suited man, who had eventually offered his name as Reeves without a first name or a title, looked at the intercepts for a long time without speaking after Ethan transferred the files. When he looked up, his expression had the quality of a man who had just found the piece that made a puzzle coherent, and the coherence was not a relief, but a weight. "These were never submitted," Reeves said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact that required accounting." "No," Ethan said. "I made the decision to retain them the night of the extraction. I knew the debrief was going to be managed. I knew before I walked into it." He looked at Reeves directly. "I was the only survivor of a mission that someone very senior needed to disappear. I made a call. I'd make the same call again." Reeves looked at the files for another moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think you would." And he moved on to the next question. The 3 names Harwell gave them in the latter half of the session with Harwell, brought back into the room under different conditions, not flanked by Daniel's people now, but seated across from Reeves, with the formal weight of an institutional proceeding, settling over everything. Those 3 names produced the most significant silence Ethan had sat in all day. Reeves wrote them down by hand, which told Ethan that Reeves did not want those names entered into any digital record yet, which told Ethan how high the names sat. He recognized one of them. The recognition lived in his body before it reached his mind, a cold, specific feeling in his chest, the feeling of something that had been theoretical becoming real. He had suspected. He had traced the signature pattern toward a particular office for 3 years without being able to confirm it. Hearing the name out loud in this room from Harwell's mouth was different from suspecting it. It was the difference between a photograph of something and the thing itself. He didn't react visibly. He filed it and kept his face level and let Reeves ask the next question. At some point in the 5th hour, Whitaker brought him coffee without being asked. The gesture was small, and the coffee was bad, and it was one of the most human things that had happened to Ethan in a very long time. He drank it. At hour 6, Reeves looked at him across the table and said, "Operator Carter, what do you want out of this?" Ethan thought about the question for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer was complicated in a way that didn't compress easily into a sentence, and he wanted to give Reeves the true version rather than the version that was easier to process. "I want the record corrected," he said. "I want Marcus Webb and Devon Park and Michael Chen and Ray Ortiz to exist in the official record as what they were: decorated operators who died in service, not casualties of a mission that can't be discussed." He paused. "I want their families to know the truth of what happened. Not the operational details, just the truth that their people were betrayed and it wasn't their failure." Another pause. "And I want the operation that's been running for 4 years under cover of their deaths to be shut down before it costs more people their lives." Reeves was writing. "And personally," Reeves said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I want to drive home," he said. "I want to pick up my daughter from school, and I want to not think about this for at least 48 hours. Reeves looked up. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. "That," he said, "is the most reasonable thing anyone has said in this room today." He closed his notebook. At 6 hours and 40 minutes, the debrief ended. Ethan walked out of the command center and into the corridor and stood there for a moment with his back against the wall and let himself be. For the first time all week, just a man standing in a hallway with nothing he needed to perform and nowhere he needed to be for the next 60 seconds. His left arm ached where the sleeve had torn. The tattoo was still visible. He looked at it for a moment. The snake in its 7 coils, the 3 numbers underneath, and thought about the first time he'd had it done in a tattoo parlor, outside a base that he couldn't name, in a country he officially hadn't been in, sitting next to Marcus Webb, who was getting the same tattoo and complaining about the needle the entire time and making everyone in the parlor laugh. Marcus laughed easily. That was one of the things about him. He laughed easily and meant it every time. Ethan pulled his sleeve down over the tattoo. Then he walked down the corridor to the stairwell and went downstairs. Ryan Mitchell was waiting in the lobby of the administration building. Not pacing, standing still, which was unusual enough for Ryan that it registered immediately. He'd been there long enough that the stillness had become deliberate, the chosen stillness of a man who had decided to wait and had committed to it. He straightened when he saw Ethan. 6 hours, Ryan said. About that? Ethan said. Ryan looked at him with the specific expression of a man who had spent 6 hours rearranging a week's worth of conclusions and had arrived at a new arrangement that was more accurate and considerably more uncomfortable than the old one. I owe you an apology, Ryan said. You don't need to. I do, Ryan said. The performance register was gone entirely. This was the voice Ethan had heard once briefly on day 2 in the rec room. The voice that existed under the loudness, quieter, more honest. The voice of a man who was capable of more than he usually showed, because showing more required a vulnerability he didn't often choose. I said things to you all week that I said because I looked at you and decided I knew what I was looking at, and I was wrong. And the thing I was wrong about wasn't just about your ability. He stopped. I was wrong about what I thought strength looked like. I've thought it looked like me for a long time. And watching you this week, even watching you do it wrong on purpose, I could tell there was something there I didn't have a category for." He looked at the floor briefly, and then back up. "I don't know everything that happened in that room, but I know you carried something for a long time to get to today, and I was one more person making it heavier, and I'm sorry for that." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "You blocked a senior officer from leaving a compound on instinct," Ethan said. "With no information and no order. You just read the situation and you moved. That's not nothing, Ryan." Ryan absorbed this. "Is that what you actually think? Or are you being generous?" "I don't do generous," Ethan said. "I do accurate." Something shifted in Ryan's face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to it, a man exhaling something he'd been holding. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan said. "Go ahead." "The tattoo, the unit. What was it?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "A unit that did work that couldn't be connected to anything official. The kind of work where if it went wrong, nobody could know it happened. The people in it understood that going in." He paused. "It went wrong, and nobody was supposed to know." "But you made them know," Ryan said. "I tried to," Ethan said. "Today was the first day it looked like it might actually work." Ryan nodded slowly. He was doing the math that everyone who heard the outline of this story did, the years, the cost, the singular determination of a man who had kept going with no support structure and a child to raise, and no guarantee that any of it would ever arrive anywhere. The math always came out the same way, and the result was always something that didn't have a clean name. "How do you do it?" Ryan asked, not rhetorically, genuinely. 4 years, alone. How do you keep going? Ethan thought about it honestly. "I called my daughter every night," he said. "She's 8. She thought I was job hunting." A pause. "Every night I heard her voice, I remembered what it was for. Not the mission. Not the case. Her." He reached up and touched the inside pocket of his jacket, the slight stiffness of folded paper through the fabric. "And I said 4 names every morning when I woke up, in the order they died. Because they couldn't keep going, and I could, and that felt like a reason." Ryan was very still. "What were their names?" he asked. Ethan told him. "All 4. In order." Ryan repeated them quietly once under his breath, the way you repeated something you intended to remember. Then Gallagher came down the stairwell behind Ethan and stopped at the bottom landing and looked between the two of them with the expression of a man who had been released from a secured room and wasn't yet sure what the outside of that room felt like. "They're letting me go," Gallagher said. The statement had a question in it. "Reeves cleared you," Ethan said. "Your cooperation is on the record." Gallagher leaned against the wall. He let out a breath that had clearly been held for a long time. "I thought I was going to federal prison," he said. "I was sitting up there doing the math on how I was going to explain this to my mother." "You didn't do anything wrong," Ethan said. "You were deceived, and you corrected course when you had the information to do so. That's the best any person can do." Gallagher looked at him. "I saw through you on day 2, he said. "I confronted you in the middle of a drill." "Yes," Ethan said. "And you still trusted me." "Not completely," Ethan said, "but enough. And you came through." He paused. "That matters." Gallagher looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, there was something in his face that was quieter than anything Ethan had seen from him all week. Not the performed calm of a man managing surveillance, not the compressed fear of a man who knew more than he wanted to know. Just a man in a lobby at the end of something that had cost him something real. "What happens now?" Gallagher asked. "For you," Ethan said. "You finish the program. You become whatever you were going to become before any of this." He looked at both of them. For the program, Whitaker said, it continues. The assessment results stand. The week happened. Ryan made a sound that was almost a laugh. "We're going to finish the program." "If you pass," Ethan said. "I passed?" Ryan said. "Automatic." Then he caught himself, and the awareness of how automatic it had been moved across his face, and he said more quietly, "Sorry." "Don't apologize for being good at what you're good at," Ethan said. "Just know there are other ways to be good at things." Whitaker came down the stairs, and the three of them straightened. The colonel looked at Ethan for a moment, then at Ryan and Gallagher, then back at Ethan, and he had the expression of a man who had just made a series of decisions he was going to live with for the rest of his career, and who was against the odds at peace with them. "Carter," he said, "Reeves has authorized your departure. You're free to go." "My application file," Ethan said. "The identity documentation. Being managed," Whitaker said. "The details of how you entered the program will not appear in any record that exists outside of Reeves's office." A pause. "For what it's worth, the records that will appear will reflect that an operator of the 731 unit believed killed in action was located alive and provided critical intelligence leading to a significant counterintelligence action. Your name will be in that record." Ethan thought about that for a moment. "And my team," he said. "Marcus Devon Chen Ortiz." "Their records will be corrected," Whitaker said. He said it with the weight of a man making a commitment in front of witnesses. "I will personally ensure it. Their families will receive full notification. The manner of their deaths, everything that can be declassified and given to the people who loved them, will be given." He paused. "I cannot undo what happened, but I can make sure it's true from here forward." Ethan stood with that for a moment. He thought of Marcus's daughter, who was 10 now, who had grown up with a story about her father that was shorter and smaller than the truth. He thought of Devon's wife, who had received a flag and a letter that couldn't say what it needed to say. He thought of Chen's parents, who were from a generation that had trusted the institution completely and had been failed by it in the specific way that institutions failed. People not with malice, but with the cold efficiency of a system protecting itself. He thought of all the things those families had been carrying that were about to get heavier and lighter at the same time. "Thank you, Colonel," Ethan said. He picked up his duffel bag from the corner where it had been sitting since that morning, untouched through the entire course of the day. He slung it over his shoulder. He shook Whitaker's hand. He shook Gallagher's hand. Then he turned to Ryan Mitchell. Ryan put his hand out. Ethan looked at it for a half second. Then he took it, and Ryan's grip was firm, the way it was firm, with everything fully committed, no reservation, and Ethan matched it. And for a moment, two men who had spent a week seeing each other completely wrong stood in a lobby and shook hands, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't a sentence that fit, and both of them knew that, and it was all right. Ethan walked out. The drive home took 2 hours and 12 minutes. He drove the speed limit the entire way, which was unusual for him, but he was in no hurry. He had been in a hurry for 4 years. For the next 2 hours and 12 minutes, he drove the speed limit and kept both hands on the wheel and let the familiar mile markers of the route from Fort Liberty count down without trying to make them go faster. He called Mrs. Hendricks when he was 40 minutes out. "Oh, you're coming home tonight," Mrs. Hendricks said. "Lily didn't say anything." "She doesn't know," Ethan said. "I was supposed to be gone 3 more days. Don't tell her. I want to surprise her." "Oh, she'll be beside herself," Mrs. Hendricks said in the warm, particular voice of a woman in her 60s who had been next-door witness to the quiet, steady, difficult project of Ethan Carter raising a daughter alone. "She's been checking the clock since 4 o'clock. She always does." "I know," Ethan said. He parked in front of the house at 7:22 in the evening. The Miller's porch light across the street was on. It was always on. He sat in the truck for a moment and looked at the front door of the house. The yellow light through the window, the small shadow that moved past the curtain on the left side, and the shadow was the particular size and shape of an 8-year-old girl who was probably watching a show she was supposed to be asleep for, and the sight of it did something to Ethan's chest that he had no military language for and didn't need any. He got out of the truck. He walked to the front door. He put his key in the lock. He heard her voice before the door was fully open, not calling for him, not expecting him, just Lily, being Lily, talking to the television in the running commentary she kept up with fictional characters when she thought no one was listening. "No, don't go in there," That's such a bad idea. Why would you? He pushed the door open. She turned. The moment between her turning and her processing lasted maybe 1 full second, her face in the transit between whatever expression it had been in and the expression that arrived when she understood what she was seeing. And then she was off the couch with the total body commitment that only children brought to physical motion. And she crossed the living room in 4 steps and hit him at waist height with enough force that he took a step back, and he dropped the duffel and wrapped both arms around her and held on. She didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did he. Then into his jacket she said, "You're early." "Yeah," he said. "You said 3 more days." "I finished early." She pulled back just far enough to look up at him, her arms still around his waist, her face doing the specific evaluation that she'd been doing since she was 5. The look that checked whether he was okay in all the ways that mattered, not just the visible ones. "Are you okay?" she said. "For real, not the regular okay." He looked at her for a moment. The yellow moon nightlight was visible through the bedroom doorway. The television was still murmuring. Everything in the house was exactly where it had been when he left, and also completely different because he was in it. "For real," he said. "Yeah, I think so." She held the look for another second, the way she held things with the patience of a child who had learned that waiting was sometimes how you got the true version of something. Then she nodded. She believed him. She tucked herself back under his arm, and they stood there in the doorway for a moment, his hand on the back of her head, her face against his jacket, the card that said, "Come home," folded over his chest between them. "I had that dream again," she said. "The field, the people who couldn't see you." "Yeah," he said. "This time they all saw you at the end," she said. "And you looked okay. You looked like yourself." A pause. "Actually, yourself. Not the version of yourself you do when you think I don't notice you're not okay." He closed his eyes. "That sounds like a good dream," he said. "It was," she said. He held her for another moment, and the house was quiet, and the porch light was on across the street, and 4 names moved through him in the order they always moved: Marcus Devon, Chen Ortiz. But tonight, the weight of them was different. Not lighter, not less real. Just different the way the weight of something changed when you had finally carried it to the place it needed to go and set it down. He hadn't set it down completely. He didn't know if he ever would. But tonight, he had set it down far enough to stand upright without it. That was something. That was, in fact, everything. 3 weeks later, the investigation that Reeves's office opened produced the first indictment. It was sealed, which meant it didn't appear in any news cycle, which meant the world did not learn about it the way the world learned about things that appeared in news cycles. But the people who needed to know knew, and the operation that had been running for 4 years, under cover of 4 men's deaths, was shut down in its entirety within a week of the indictment. And the 3 names that Harwell had given in Whitaker's command center, the names that had produced the largest silence of the day, those names were in the sealed document on the 3rd page, and 2 of them were placed on administrative leave, pending investigation the same afternoon. Ethan was not in any of those rooms when those things happened. He was at Lily's school play, sitting in a folding chair in a gymnasium that smelled like sneakers and stage fright, watching his daughter play the role of a talking tree in a production about the seasons. She had exactly 2 lines. She delivered both of them with the specific theatrical commitment of a child who had decided that talking trees were serious business, and anyone who thought otherwise was wrong. He clapped louder than anyone in the room. She saw him from the stage, and her gap-toothed smile went as wide as it went, which was very wide, and Ethan Carter sat in a folding chair in a gymnasium at a school play, and felt the kind of ordinary happiness that no amount of training prepared you for, and no amount of loss could permanently take away. It was still there, under everything. It had always been still there. Reeves called him 2 days later, with an update delivered in the efficient, low-effect tone of a man reporting operational outcomes. "The records correction for Webb, Park, Chen, and Ortiz has been formally processed," Reeves said. "Their families received notification this morning. Official letters with full context what can be released. Personal visits for next of kin, where location allowed." A pause. Webb's daughter is 10 years old. Her mother said she asked if her father was brave. Another pause. They told her yes. Ethan sat in his kitchen with the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. "Good?" he said finally. His voice was steady. "That's good." "There's something else," Reeves said. "Whitaker has put your name forward for formal reinstatement of rank. The 731 designation. There's a discussion about a posthumous unit commendation for the full team to be accompanied by your service reinstatement. It would mean going back on the official record, public record." A pause. "I wanted to make sure you understood what that means before anyone moved forward with it." Ethan thought about it. Going back on the official record meant existing in a category that he had been removed from 4 years ago without his knowledge or consent. It meant being again the thing the tattoo said he was. It meant having the conversation with Lily that he had been putting together in pieces for 4 years. The conversation that started with, "There are things about your father's work," and ended somewhere he hadn't been able to fully picture. It also meant Marcus Webb's name on a commendation, Devin's name, Chen's, Ortiz's, on a document that was real and official and couldn't be managed or buried or administered away by someone with the right signatures. "Tell Whitaker yes," Ethan said. "And tell him thank you." He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes. The same kitchen table where he'd sat in the dark 7 days ago with a cold cup of coffee and a purple crayon card and the particular quality of pre-mission stillness that had no civilian name for it. The clock on the wall read 9:14 in the morning. Through the window, the neighborhood was doing what it always did. The Miller's porch light off in the daytime, a car going slowly down the street, a dog being walked by a man who walked it every morning at this time, and always stopped at the same tree for the same amount of time, because routines were how people organized a world that didn't have natural order. Ethan got up and made himself a cup of coffee. He stood at the counter while it brewed and thought about Ryan Mitchell, who had called the day after the assessment to ask a single question, "Are you going to be okay?" and seemed genuinely relieved by the answer, and had left it there, which was the most Ryan Mitchell respecting boundaries thing Ethan could have imagined. He thought about Gallagher, who had completed the program and according to Whitaker's office had scored in the top third of the cohort, and who had sent Ethan a text the previous week that said only, "I said the 4 names this morning. Is that weird?" And Ethan had written back, "No, do it every day if you want." And Gallagher had written back, "Okay." And that was the end of that conversation, and it was also not the end of it. He thought about Dolan. Master Sergeant Dolan, who had run him twice on the wall and watched him from the edges all week, with the instincts of a man who had been doing this work long enough that instinct and expertise had fused into something he couldn't fully separate, who had stopped Ethan on the way out of the compound to say exactly one thing. "Next time you run an assessment in my program, Carter, do it at your actual level. I want to see what that looks like." Ethan had said, "There won't be a next time." Dolan had said, "We'll see." The coffee finished. He poured it. He sat back down at the table. On the table in front of him was a piece of paper. New paper, clean, not the purple crayon card that was back in his jacket pocket where it lived. This was a piece of paper he'd put there this morning with a specific intention. A letter he'd been composing in his head for 3 weeks and had finally decided to put down in words, because some things needed to exist on paper and not just in the compressed space inside a person where they carried the things they hadn't said yet. It was a letter to Marcus Webb's daughter, not detailing the mission, not the operational specifics, just the truth of the man, the way he laughed, the way he said her name when he talked about her, the way he stood on a tarmac at the start of a mission that would be his last and put his hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "We get this right and we go home," with the complete uncomplicated conviction of a man who fully intended to be right. Ethan picked up a pen. He started writing. The words came easier than he'd expected. Maybe because he'd been saying them internally for 4 years, and the path from inside to outside was worn smooth by now. Maybe because Marcus's daughter was 10 years old, and 10-year-old girls deserved the truth about their fathers, and the truth about Marcus Webb was that he was brave and funny and completely committed to the people beside him, and that he had died that way, and that the man who had survived to write this letter had spent 4 years making sure that death meant something, and was still even now making sure. He wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When he finished, he set the pen down and read it through once the way he read everything once, after evenly looking for what wasn't true, correcting what wasn't exact. Nothing needed correcting. It was the truest thing he'd written in his adult life, and also the simplest. He folded it. He put it in an envelope. He wrote a name on the front. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the purple crayon card, the one that said, "Good luck, Daddy," and had the stick figures in the corner, and he opened it and looked at the 2 words that had carried him across a week he'd spent years building toward. Come home. He had come home. Not just to this house, not just to this table and this coffee and this ordinary morning light through the window. He had come home to himself, to the person he'd been before the mission, before the betrayal, before 4 years of carrying something alone in the dark with no certainty that it would ever arrive anywhere. He had come home to the version of Ethan Carter that existed before he'd had to choose between being a father and being a soldier, and had chosen both imperfectly with everything he had every single day. He was still both things. He was always going to be both things. But today, for the first time in 4 years, those 2 things were not at war with each other. He put the card back in his pocket. He put the letter in his jacket. He picked up his coffee and he drank it while it was still hot, which was the small, specific luxury of a man who had no mission to rush toward, and nowhere he needed to be for the next several hours, except here, in this kitchen, in this house, in the ordinary morning of a life that was going to be difficult and incomplete, and full of things he couldn't fix. And also, this was the part he was just learning to let be true, worth every single day of living it. The porch light across the street was off. The dog and his owner had completed their morning ritual and gone home. The clock on the wall moved its second hand with the patient indifference of a clock doing what clocks did. And Ethan Carter sat in his kitchen in the morning light, and for the first time in 4 years, he was not carrying the future toward something. He was simply in it. That was enough. That was finally and completely and without qualification enough.